The Allied powers of World War II all had their own conflicting ideologies and visions for a post-war Europe. So then, how did they manage to come to consensus on how to govern their defeated enemy? Just how was the occupation, and eventually the division of Germany, decided? Well, the leaders of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union met at 3 international summits towards the end of the war and afterwards to debate their enemy's future. Their conferences at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam were where the Allies more or less worked out their approach to post-war Germany and the borders of their eventual occupation zones. They were led by Presidents Franklin Roosevelt and later Harry Truman, Prime Ministers Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee, and Joseph Stalin. So did those leaders intend to divide Germany? The answer to that is basically yes, but not in the way that it ended up happening. And splitting the country into East and West was more of a Cold War accident. The big 3 Allied powers first met in late 1943 at the Tehran Conference in Anglo-Soviet-occupied Iran. With panzers still in Russia and no one but Germans on the Normandy beaches, the Allies kicked the can down the road. For the time being, it was more important to win than debate the spoils. A year later, at Yalta in the Soviet Crimea, the fighting was still ongoing but nearly over, and the leaders left with a plan dividing up occupation duties but not a final plan for Germany. It was at Potsdam, 2 months after their common enemy had been destroyed, that the competing interests of East and West came to be front and center. Allied occupation policy, including adding in the French, was finalized but in a much less friendly atmosphere, which, as it turned out, was not going to get better. Speaking of uneasy alliances, you can fight for a faction of your own in this video's sponsor, the naval combat game World of Warships Legends. The people behind World of Warships have done a really impressive job recreating historical vessels from across the world and across time for you to take control of online, and it's just received an update bringing the game into the modern era. They've added ships with more recent naval advances to their already 100-strong collection of World War I and World War II era vessels, most notably including the revolutionary ability to fire guided missiles. They've also added a suitably modern worldwide event to compete in, a battle over blackline crude oil. As a commander, you now get to fight on and above the sea, reliant on your strategic skills to bring about victory. Legends is free to play on Xbox, PlayStation, and now on PC through Steam, so play World of Warships Legends, the modern era, with 8 million others for free right now through my link in the description. So, back at Tehran in 1943, all were agreed. Germany, in no form, could ever be allowed to make war on them again. How to make that happen, and what a post-war settlement for Germany should look like, was more contentious. As far as plenty of Russians, and also the French, were concerned, the Germans had been nothing but trouble since 1870, and more extreme Allied proposals would have split Germany into as many weaker countries as possible, as it had been before German unification. In the final communique of the Yalta Conference, Britain, the US, and USSR reserved the right to dismember Germany without specifying exactly how. So what might have been done? That was discussed at length, and it shouldn't be surprising that the different powers had different priorities. They'd formed the European Consultative Commission at Tehran, which worked out a system of practical control through 1944, drawing lines for 3, by Potsdam 4, occupation zones. Those weren't meant to be permanent, but West and East Germany were created in opposition to each other when the Soviets and the Western powers found they could no longer work together. Alternative ideas were more punishing, or just more strange. President Roosevelt proposed dividing Germany into 5 parts at Tehran in December 1943. The British, under Churchill, proposed 2, a North and a South German state, and Stalin, at that point, indicated he agreed with the Americans. They had some reasoning in common. A dissected Germany wouldn't be a dangerous Germany. But for FDR, it ended there, while for Moscow, no centralized Germany meant a wide-open door to the heart of Europe. That had both strategic and ideological implications. It was Britain, not the United States, which was the most ardent Cold War warrior before the Cold War had even really begun. Much more so than Roosevelt, Churchill despised communism and never really expected the Red Army to establish democracies in Eastern Europe, as Stalin promised to do, in writing, at both Yalta and Potsdam. The British rushed across North Germany in 1945 to prevent the Soviets from liberating Denmark, and that May, Churchill signed off on Operation Unthinkable, dual plans for a surprise Western offensive to free Poland, which was ultimately deemed unfeasible, and so became a defensive strategy against a possible Soviet push west. Accordingly, Churchill's proposals for Germany were at least as much about containing Moscow as weakening Berlin. Two states seemed to fit the bill, and Germany already had two roughly natural north-south divides. One between majority Protestant and Catholic regions, and another between speakers of different German dialects. He would have attached Austria to the southern state and extended it as far as Hungary to create a strong confederation along the Danube. By 1945, though, Britain was broke, while America was in her ascendancy, and London tended to go along with what the Americans had to say. The US had backed off the idea of half a dozen German states by the Yalta Conference in favor of neutering German industry directly. Every Allied capital focused attention on Germany's industrial heartlands. They were the Ruhr Valley in the Rhineland, the nearby Saarland, and Upper Silesia in today's Poland, all full of war-sustaining iron ore, coal, and factories. The US Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, believed the German will to fight would survive the war and democratic re-education, and he won President Roosevelt to that way of thinking. His plan called for the Saar and the surrounding areas to be ceded to France, for Upper Silesia to be made a part of Poland, and for indefinite international control of northwest Germany, including the Ruhr. On top of that, East Prussia would be split between the Poles and the Soviets, which had also featured in Churchill's plan, Schleswig would go to Denmark, and what remained would be split into North and South German states. Austria would be independent but have a customs union with the South, and all of Germany would be economically reorganized away from manufacturing and towards agriculture. In the meantime, the Soviet and British leaders had met in Moscow, and the abilities of Joseph Stalin were a large part of why that meeting, and the Yalta Conference a few months later, could go smoothly enough. Specifically, his ability to lie, or at least to change his mind on a whim. Having supported Roosevelt's five-state plan at Tehran, Stalin now told Churchill that he favored the British proposed North-South divide and Churchill's Southern German Confederation with its capital in Vienna, though he ruled out including Hungary. Possibly, Stalin predicted, correctly as it turned out, that he would be the first to Austria, and saw in a Vienna-centered federation an opportunity to extend Soviet influence into Central Europe. He and Churchill also discussed denying Prussia the Ruhr and the Saar through a possible third state in the Rhineland. That idea was at least as old as the region's occupation after the First World War, when Rhenish leaders, including the future West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, spoke of a Rhine Republic as a counter to Prussian German hegemony. It was also heavily favored by the French. Within the Soviet Union, what Stalin wanted, Stalin got, and what Stalin most wanted from the West was Poland. The Polish government in exile was based in London, and tens of thousands of Poles had fought on from the west after the fall of Poland in 1939. In Moscow, Churchill and Stalin committed vaguely to compensating the Poles with pre-war German territory. It only would have felt more genuine if Stalin himself hadn't already annexed about half of pre-war Poland, the part he'd seized in 1939 after making a secret deal with the Germans, which he got the Western leaders to accept at Yalta. To be fair, they didn't have much of a choice. The Red Army had pushed through to Warsaw before the West had even crossed the River Rhine. Still, the plan for the rest of Germany adopted at Yalta was only for the practical occupation zones, not a final peace settlement. With victory, the Big Three leaders met outside Berlin at Potsdam in July and August 1945. They'd already asserted that the German state no longer existed and that they'd taken on its legal powers. President Truman and the British further agreed to putting all of Germany east of the Oder and Neisse rivers under Polish administration. Plenty of that was home to ethnic Poles, but centuries-old German cities, Stettin, Breslau, Danzig, had their German populations expelled. The West also agreed that the Soviets could annex German Königsberg in East Prussia, modern-day Kaliningrad. Serious inter-Allied debates on Eastern Germany realistically had become moot when it came into Soviet hands, but the punitive logic of plans like Morgenthau's helps explain American willingness to accept the Soviet annexations. The British and Americans also extracted more promises from Stalin, in writing, again as they had at Yalta, that he would allow for free and fair elections in Poland specifically, and generally in regions under Soviet occupation. Suffice to say, that did not happen, contributing enormously to Western distrust of Moscow. As for what is Germany today, Truman, Stalin, and Attlee signed off on the final product of the European Consultative Commission, creating 4 occupation zones for themselves and the French. Annoyed at being excluded from the discussions, soon they unilaterally cut off the Saarland and spent a decade trying to Frankify the population. On the issue of a final peace settlement, nothing came out of Potsdam beyond a commitment to reaching one in the future. In the future, Stalin did not keep to his pledges to bring democracy to Eastern Europe, and by July 1945, America had a far more suspicious of the Soviets president in Harry Truman. Morgenthau was dismissed by Truman, but deindustrialization in the American zone was kept around for the first 2 years of his administration. That changed in 1947 and 48 as the first steps towards creating West Germany were taken in the Western zones, the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, and the Iron Curtain descended. Moscow formed the Cominform in 1947 and openly declared itself in an ideological war with the US-led West, which formed NATO in 1949. For a time, the Iron Curtain split Austria, which was occupied in the same way as Germany, but the Austrians avoided being pulled apart by East and West, and you can find out how in the video to the left. Or, if you're watching a few weeks after release, see how the Cold War began along the dividing line in Germany. If you like this one, either video should be right up your alley. And as always, thanks for watching Look Back History.